Good evening, folks. How are you guys doing? Hope you've been having a great weekend. Well, I have, you know, having fun, so to speak. Went golfing this morning, so yeah, I'm sure most of you as well have had, the opportunity to enjoy yourself this weekend as well. Well, yeah, welcome to another edition of Just Banter. And tonight we were supposed to be discussing the country called Rwanda and trying to figure out, if what we have been hearing about Uganda is actually true. But unfortunately, due to technical issues, our guest will not be able to join us anymore. So he's rescheduled. And hopefully, we'll be able to put something together that will catch your interest and take a deeper look at Rwanda. But hey, despite all of that, the show must go on. Now, it's football season. Everybody's talking football. Everybody's talking about what's going on in the world of football. Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, name it. It's just going on and on and on and on. But a great fan of ours, who's always with us on From a Radio and on Just Banter, is a great Arsenal fan. And in recent times, another fan of ours, who is a Manchester United fan, has been taking, I wasn't going to use that word anyways, but the person has actually been smashing Arsenal. And in the course of smashing Arsenal, we came across something that's pretty interesting. It actually started as a case of talking about parents trying to live their lives through their children, but then a joke now came out of that. Please bear with me because I'm not an Arsenal fan. I'm a Manchester United fan, so to speak. So this is not actually meant to be a jibe at Arsenal, but there's just one or two things to actually pick out from it. We'll be right back shortly after this.
There are many doctors that should be footballers today. They would have played for Man City, great clubs, Barcelona. Now they are stuck as Arsenal fans.
So you can imagine being stuck as an Arsenal fan. It's rather unfortunate, but hey, sometimes you have to take a beating and then chin up, keep going. That's the world of football. That's the world of sports. Different things happen at different times. But basically, it's just telling people, don't try and force your kids to do things. Try and look at them, try and figure out what it is that, they're talented at, and then try to push them in that direction. Give them all the support that you can. We have seen quite a few people who are already latching onto that, sending their kids to football academies. One is actually pushing his son to be a professional race car driver, Formula One and all of that. So you really need to look at your kids and try to figure that side out. That being said, these are really testy times because even kids are getting COVID-19 nowadays. Everybody's trying to keep the children safe and all that. And one of our partners, Proteus Media, published a book a little while back. And we thought maybe it was about time that we spoke about that very briefly and introduced that to all the viewers who are watching this. And hopefully they will also share it. So the name of the book is The ABC of Safety, 101 Ways, for your kids to learn different things about, health and safety. And I think it's rather important that, you introduce those type of books to your kids. We'll put the link in the description for you to be able to access the book. It's selling for just $1.99 or is it €1.99, something like that. So it's really affordable. It's in a digital format. So your kids can actually just, check it out on your mobile phone if they don't have their own mobile phones, or an iPad, or on a laptop. So very easy, easily accessible and all that. Since we're not able to bring on our guests tonight, what we decided to do is to still keep the show going, keep you entertained. We have a show that you probably haven't seen. Maybe one or two people have seen it, but it's pretty interesting. It's about African history. And we had a great guest on. Her name is Ayo Gregory Haynes, who has a platform called the Flame Tree Collective, where a lot of rich African history is being told. You might want to check that out as well. We will also put the description to that. You will also put the link to that in the description as well so that you can actually access that as well and see it. But in the meantime, you can catch Ayo on the show. See you later. Thanks. Hello, good evening. How are you doing today, folks? My name is Habib Enyola. You're welcome to another edition of Just Banter. And as usual, we're always testing things out to see what it is that we can do to give you experience. So we're testing out a new software tonight. So bear with us if things don't go like they usually do, not as smooth as they usually do. But, tonight I have a very great guest on. Her name is Ayo Haynes. Ayo is a historian and the founder of the Flame Tree Collective. Now, before we go on, I'm going to test a little something and see if it works. Hold on. We'll be right back. Hi, Ayo, how you doing?
I'm very fine.
You're welcome.
Glad to be on
You're
here.
welcome to Just Banter. Your first time of coming on, your first time of actually experiencing what it is that we do on here. And I hope you do have fun with us tonight.
Indeed, I'm looking forward to it.
So, quite a lot of stuff has been happening in recent times, and a lot of it has been centered around the issue of racism, the issue of hyper descent, so many stuff. The Black Lives Matter, movement started from George Floyd being, killed by a policeman in the United States. Prior to that, a lot of people have been talking about what they call institutional racism. In Western countries, United States, in England, all over. And for so many people, it was a case of Africans have a history. Why are Africans forced to migrate out of Africa? Why are Africans supposedly subservient when it comes to other races? What exactly or why or how did our history go missing?
Why did our history go missing? Well, that's a very detailed question, but it's to cut a long story short, because it's convenient. It was convenient in many ways for African people in general to not know their history, to not know their power, their past, because then it made us easier to control when we stepped out of our continent, when we were then taken into other arenas, when we went to Europe, when we went to the Americas, and so on. So in many ways, African history was written out purposely because it made the conqueror's job easier.
It made the conqueror's job easier. Now, before we had the Portuguese and the Germans, and then eventually the British coming to the shores of Africa, a lot had been going on. You had Aztec kings, you had the Songhai, you had the Zulu. Zulu, I think, is it the Zulu nation?
Yes,
Shaka
indeed.
Shaka Zulu that everybody hears about and all of that. You had the likes of Mansa Musa, the man who caused inflation, on his way to the Hajj,
An inflation that lasted 10 years and brought Africa back onto the map because of the amount of gold he spent on his Hajj, indeed.
So the average African should have a lot of dignity. So, but for a lot of them, it's not happening. Now, I read a book very recently, something to do with the missing manuscripts, in Timbuktu. A lot of families actually were holding on to a lot of those manuscripts. They were actually hiding those manuscripts because they did not want those manuscripts to go missing. So you've had manuscripts that have been with some families for 400, 500 years, and it's actually hidden in a well, securely wrapped in something, protected, and then dropped inside the water and held by a string, so that nobody can have access to it. They were able to get a couple of families on board to actually agree to release some of those manuscripts, and those manuscripts were taken back to South Africa, to an institute in South Africa, to actually be, translated and all of that, because they're written in ancient languages. Now, for most people, they still don't have access to that type of history. But for you, you've been doing some fantastic work with the Flame Tree Collective, telling us a lot of history. I mean, I did history, and you still know so much more than I do. What can you tell us about those type of manuscripts, where our history is hidden, and all of that?
So I think the manuscripts of Timbuktu in themselves are such a unique and a special volume of work because it gives us a unique written insight into African history told by Africans from that time period. Because when you look at a lot of our medieval, our ancient history, it's written by Europeans, by Arabs, by people from other continents, other places. And so no matter what it is, as an outsider, you will always have a different perspective than somebody who comes from within that culture, within that community. And so when we look at the manuscripts of Timbuktu, they tell us what it was like to be an African living in Mali in that time period. It talks about things like recipes. You learn about the transactions between traders, as well as the religious texts as well. Written in a language that we still understand and use frequently today, Arabic, but also some of those documents written in the traditional African languages using the Arabic script. So in that sense, it is such an amazing volume of work. And as I said, because most of our history isn't written down, in Africa, we have a tradition of passing our history down in story form. So usually it's sitting around the fireplace, in the evening, or it's sitting under a tree with your grandparents. And this is how our stories, this is how our history is passed down traditionally. But in Timbuktu, we have this unique moment in time when our history was written down in huge amounts of work. The fact that it's been preserved is a freak of nature because, the fact that there have been many wars that have gone through that region over time. There was actually a time when one of the kings who conquered Timbuktu actually was against the university, and many manuscripts were destroyed at that point in time. And that was the first time that they were taken and hidden by the families. And then it happened again after the university sort of went to an end. And even more recently in history, when we had the jihad movement that came in again, wanting to destroy some of those manuscripts, many families still managed to preserve it. So luckily, people, even without understanding what's written in the books, understand the importance of preserving these books. And this is why we still have them today.
Okay, hold that thought. 1 second. I'll be right back.
Okay.
This is what happens when you're doing new stuff. You get a bit disorganized and all of that. But with you. Now, apparently, it seems like we're not connected to Facebook and YouTube. So while we're talking, I think I'll just try and connect and see. Do you have your Facebook on?
No. Do I need to put it on?
I'm just going to send you an invite to just join now.
Log in now.
Let's just continue. What we'll do is we'll just probably just repost the video again for you know, afterwards. So we're doing the stuff. We're doing the stuff today. Now, recently, the president of Haiti was killed, was assassinated, and the history of Haiti came, under the spotlight all over again. The first colony to actually gain independence. The first black colony to be self-governed, the first black nation to actually defeat the then superpowers of the world, France, Spain, and the British as well. But that country has never truly been, on course, so to speak. They've always had short-termism when it comes to leadership. The average lifespan of any leader that goes, that ascends into the position of power in that country is about 2 years, except probably the Papa Doc Duvalier and his son Baby Doc Duvalier. who collectively spent about close to 30 years. Now, they were revered because they were practicing the traditional African religions. A lot of people feared them. There's a lot of correlationship between the traditional African religions and the history of Africa in itself. How did traditional African religion become disjointed from our history? Do you have any idea how?
There's a wonderful saying that says, when the white man arrived in Africa, we had the land and they had the book. And when he left, we had the book and they had the land, or something along those lines. But it's that whole idea of we had something of value. We had a knowledge of who we were. We had a pride in who we were. And when Europeans came with colonialization, with imperialism, they undermined that, core belief in who we were. And they told us that your ways are not great, your ways are inadequate, are barbaric, are ancient. You must come to our side, follow our religion, follow our ways, our traditions. And by the time we opened our eyes and realized, hang on, this change has happened, the power shift had occurred. And so for us, many of us Africans, it's the case of you don't then value who you are because you feel that who you are is perhaps not as good as who they are. And that's one of the great, cons of the world. And unfortunately, that has led to many of the issues that we face on the continent, even till today. But definitely the fact that Haiti had that strong link with voodoo, which is in itself derived from the traditional Ifa religion and so on, is what helped the revolution in the first place. Because it was that strong focus on the fact that they kept the traditions alive. They used voodoo as a way of preserving their sense of who they were. So although on the plantations, on the Sunday, they went to church with the masters, they still went in the evenings to the voodoo ceremonies and kept that link. And that was how they were able to even organize the revolution, by holding these meetings and working together from that sense. Again, you mentioned the Duvaliers. Their control over Haiti was because of how they tapped into the belief in voodoo. So when we look at the fact that we have our African links still intricately bind us, even though we might not understand it, those links are there. So whether it's language, whether it's culture, whether it's tradition or religion, these are the things that still call us, still bring us together. These are the stories of our childhood, the stories of our past that sort of ring down through to us. And so Haiti is a wonderful example. Yes, it was the very first island, the first country that not just had a revolution or revolt, but successfully managed to push out the European powers and keep power. And if they had been left to their own devices, they would probably have been a very successful nation. But because the whole thought of white supremacy and superiority was there within Europe at that time, especially within the Americas at that time, they could not have the fact that there was this black ex-slave community that was now thriving. Because remember, Haiti at the time was one of the most profitable islands in terms of the goods that came from there. So you had, the sugar plantations, cotton, tobacco, and so on. At one point, 1 in every 8 people in metropolitan France, their income was derived in some way from goods that came from Haiti, from that economy and that industry. So you can see how important it was, in the grander global sense. But when Haiti decided to take that power back and say, you know what, we are going to rule ourselves, we are going to do this well. And already they had managed to do this in sense of mobilizing troops, kicking out and resisting the Europeans and setting up a government and their own colony, their own community. They had such a great foundation to be able to do more, but this was not going to be allowed. And so they were blocked with the French insisting they had to pay repatriations. The fact that most Western countries refused to trade with Haiti. And so therefore their economy was sort of cut at the root. If you haven't got money coming in, if you haven't got connections, you're not going to be successful. And then you have also other governments coming in and infiltrating their politics, making sure that there was always that era of instability. Because again, if you have an unstable government, it's a lot easier for you to sort of get on with what you want to do in the background. So that's sort of a very complex picture, but it just goes to show again how, if we're not careful, it's very easy to look at the surface and say, oh, they should have done so much better. How come they haven't achieved much? How come they're still the poorest country in the Americas? Could they not have done more? Well, actually, they could have if they were not undermined every step of the way.
So when you speak about them being undermined and the strategy that's been employed forever against Haiti, you now have to look at the relationship between that and Africa, especially when you look at, I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in a series of events. So when you look at the strategy that France used against Haiti, it seems very similar to what they used against the colonies in Africa, the French colonies in Africa.
Exactly.
Now, in a book called The Art of War, it says there that the person that creates the chaos is the only person that can actually see clearly within that chaos. So you now see a lot of former French colonies. Neocolonialism is still there, but former French colonies who have never been able, to actually get their economies going. Everything they do is to the French system. They have never really truly been able to get back, their true sense of identity, except for probably maybe a country like Benin Republic, where if you go, to the Republic, especially during the summer, you will see that there are a lot of festivals that take place there. And those festivals are related to the traditional religion and all of that. And they do have national holidays for those traditional religions. So, or those traditional ceremonies, right? So it seems more a case of they've been trying very hard to keep their identity in that country. For all the other, French colonies, they don't even have a central bank. All their money is warehoused in France. So it's been a case of continuous suppression. But there's still a school of thought that says there's no such thing as institutionalized racism. Is that true?
Of course not. Institutionalized racism has always been there from when the race was created. Because when you look back through history, race is actually quite a modern concept. Through time, you've always had people in terms of different tribes. So you were Chinese, you were Indian, you were, Norse, you were Celtic, you were Malian, you were Malinke, whatever it was, our tribes were how we identified. And it didn't matter the color of your skin, because I think people understood even at that time that actually your color of skin did not matter. It was more your cultural identity and your tribal identity and links. And that was how people identified themselves. And then there was that shift in time when suddenly race became very important. And it was to do with the birth of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. Specifically because people had to almost justify the inhumane treatments that they were putting out to Africans who were being taken from their homes. And the only way they could sort of, make themselves feel better was to say, well, they're not quite on our level. Well, they're a different race anyway. And by making those excuses and creating this thought that actually we have different races, we have one race, we're the human race. If you look at us, in terms of people, melanin is skin deep. So you have people who are very light, very dark. Within families, you get throwbacks coming generations down the line where you have a white family and then there'll be a child who looks mixed race or who comes out quite dark skinned. Again, vice versa. You'll have an African family who will then end up with a child with blondish hair or green eyes. So these throwbacks always happen because we as humans have always mixed through time. I mean, looking at myself as well, I'm half English, half Nigerian. Growing up in Nigeria, for me, my identity has always been more grounded in my African background. But I also have cousins within my own family, exactly the same sort of English-Nigerian mix, who grew up within the UK system, and their grounding is much more within the British setting, because you accept and you assimilate what you grow up around, what you're used to. So in terms of institutional racism, that kind of came about as a way of making sure that those in power remained in power. And the only way you can do this is to make sure that the masses never unite against you. You know, if you want to look at the American setting, when they first had the system of slavery within the Americas, it was not a black-white thing. They had Irish slaves. They had slaves from the First Nations. They had slaves from the Caribbean tribes who were taken as well as the Africans who were brought from Africa. So there was a mix of people who were within this subclass of being enslaved. And it was nothing to do with the color of your skin. And then you had a few revolts where people got together and said, we're not tolerating this anymore. We're not taking, the treatment anymore. And they rose up against the ruling classes and were almost successful in some instances. And this was when the powers that be went, right, we cannot take this. And they then used the color of your skin as a way to further divide people. So suddenly the Irish and the Europeans who had been in that setting of being enslaved or as indentured servants were now told, you're still beneath us, but you are above them. And so that sense of superiority was then put into people. And it became divided not on class, but on color of skin, but on race. And that, I think, was part of where institutional racism really sort of became ingrained within sort of the modern world.
So, but for a lot of people, they don't know the difference when it comes to race. So as far as they're concerned, it's either you're Caucasian, you're Black, you're Hispanic, and all that. How do you define race?
How do I define race?
In the context of what you just explained
We have
now.
one race. I believe we have one race, the human race, but we have subsets within it. You have, people who live within a certain area who have physical adaptations that suit their climate. Yeah. So Africans within Africa developed natural, darker skin, more melanin to, protect themselves from the sun, from the African sun. You have the Mongols and people within, Northern Asia who have very broad and very flat noses, again, protecting them against the winds, the harsh winds in the Gobi Desert and on the plains of Mongolia. You have people who are quite tall and lanky. Again, those sort of different adaptations suit the environment. If you even want to go down to genetic levels, when you look at our blood, within the African context, many people have heard about sickle cell. And the fact that if you are AS, you carry the trait for sickle cell, but not the disease. Well, actually, that adaptation, that mutation for the AS is biology's way, our body's way of protecting us against malaria. Because people who are AS are less likely to suffer from malaria, badly. They might have it, but not as intense as if you were AA. So from a natural point of view, our genetics, our biology went, we will sacrifice the odd SS. We don't mind the AA, but we're actually aiming for the AS within this sort of West African context because this is a malaria prevalence zone. And so you get these sort of adaptations within different people groups. Some of them you can see on the skin, some are, further down within us, that you can say are down to the constructs of race. But even when they look at the fact that they studied like skull shapes to say, okay, this particular skull, these features are only from an African or only from a Caucasian and so on, they studied very small numbers of skulls. They didn't do massive numbers of research then in order to make a very wide decision. And so we take what they say as, yeah, this is what they did the study, they did the research, it must be true. But actually, you look back on it, and they didn't look at hundreds and thousands of people to compare. And if you do look at people now, you will find exactly the same skull shapes within different skull shapes within the same sort of ethnic group. Just showing that at the end of it, we are just all human, which is kind of where I look at it. We are the human race, but we have the nuances of our culture and our unique sort of placement in the world.
Okay, viewers, I've had quite a few extra intelligent people come on the show, and we've had some beautiful conversations. I think I ranks among one of the top three, don't you think? What do you think? No, Ayo. The way you actually are able to break things down is very insightful. You're a great teacher. You have the Flame Tree Collective, and I actually was privileged to be able to watch one of the presentations. There were several things that I noticed in the course of watching that presentation. One of it is what you've just exhibited right now, your ability to break down things in such a way that even a 5-year-old would understand. Now, I'll now go back to the African history in itself. At that session, you were talking about the likes of the Shaka Zulu and quite a few things that people didn't know. How they were able to raise their own civilization, how they were able to stabilize, have their own systems of government and things like that. We also know that in Benin back then, you also had something similar as well. Now, how come, if we look at it from the context of the level of development as of that time for Africa and for Europe, how were the Europeans able to take Africa 300 years backwards?
Well, so it comes down to almost the perfect storm. Okay, so when we look at African history overall, over time, or rather, when you look at history in itself over time, every civilization has a moment in time when it rises and then it falls again. You can look at that in terms of the Romans. You can look at that in terms of the Chinese. You can look at that in terms of African civilizations. And some will even say that at the moment, perhaps we are reaching the pinnacle of our own civilization as a sort of Western world, and that is starting to shift towards a different trend. That's a story for another day.
The sun is beginning to set on the empire.
The sun is setting on our empire, indeed. But when we look at the African context in itself, you have the fact that through time, especially within the medieval period, so you're looking at sort of from about 1200 to about 1700s, there were these African empires, African kingdoms across the continent. You know, north, east, west, south. You had kingdoms with a proper political, economic, social structure. You had them with control over vast populations, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in some instances, who were living under very orderly societies, who had systems of rule that was suited to their traditions again and their culture. And these are the kingdoms that when the Europeans first arrived, so we're looking the 1400s, 1500s, with the arrival of the Portuguese traders, with the first arrival of, the Boer settlers down in South Africa, and things like that. When those first Europeans arrived on the coast of Africa, especially let's just look at just West Africa in itself, they didn't come to find people who were living in trees, like we're told. They didn't come to find people who were who were living in bare, basic societies. They found very complex societies. They came in contact with the Dahomey kingdom. You know, you've got the Dahomey female warriors, the Mino warriors, who were known as the Amazonians. And that social structure there, where they had an army, the king had an army of over 5,000 women soldiers who had such level of skill, they were able to hold the French at bay for many, many years. You had as well, they came in contact with the Asante kingdom. The Asantes themselves are a subgroup of the Akan people, who are descended from the ancient Mali Empire. So when the Mali Empire came to an end, those people moved south into what is now the area of Ghana today. And you have these structures that they came and they met. And when the Europeans arrived, they came in at a lower level. They said, hello, we're here to visit. We'd like to trade with you. You know, your king is in charge. He's the ruler here. We will do what he wants in order to get our trade. And then there was this gradual shift to the Europeans slowly getting more power. The fact that they were now starting to control the trade along the coast, and they started to undermine the kings and the chiefs and the social structure that was there. And as they gained more of a stronghold, that destabilized some of the kingdoms. You had the growth of the slave trade. So when which in itself is part of a wider experience that we have on both sides of the Atlantic. But the transatlantic slave trade in itself, because of the vast numbers of people that were being taken away from our coastline, the kingdoms who took part in the slave trade needed a constant supply of people. So they were constantly at war with their neighbors, people that they had previously traded with, over the years, over time, they were now at war with. You had the fact that many kingdoms that would have recovered and continued to build themselves up were now having to run and hide in the forest. Look at Abeokuta. That is the city that my mom comes from. The word itself, Abeokuta, means under the rock. And this is because at that time, the Egba people were running away from the Dahomian army, who were needing slaves in order to trade with the Europeans. And so the Egba went and hid under the rock in order to preserve themselves and to keep themselves alive and away from the slavers. So that destabilization within the entire region led to the fall of many kingdoms. You add on to that the fact that there was already the beginnings of climate change. So the Sahara was already starting to dry and spread further south. So people were again shifting. They were becoming climate migrants. The same like we see today. Many people are moving from their traditional homes because, again, the Sahara is spreading further. So you put that all together, and you can see why not only did many African kingdoms fall, but they were then not able to get back up. Look at the three main empires of West Africa. You had first the Ghana Empire, which was replaced by the Mali Empire, which was replaced by the Songhai Empire. As each one went down, the next one came up. And to be honest, if the Europeans had not arrived at that moment in time, the Songhai Empire probably would have fallen and another empire would have risen in its place. But because we had that interruption in history, that outside influence, it actually broke this natural rhythm of humanity, of culture that had always been there, of civilization. In terms of the fact that we are not where we should be today, it's because Africa is still recovering from a major Holocaust. There's a term called Maafa, and Maafa means the great disaster, I think it is, or the great terrible occurrence in Swahili. And many people refer to what happened to the African continent as Maafa, because so many people were taken from our shores, the young, the educated, those who were keepers of the knowledge, keepers of the skill. They were all taken away in vast numbers in a very short space of time. So they were not able to pass on their skill and their knowledge to those left behind. And you can understand then why we lost those skills, or why people who would have lived in wonderful cities would have thought, I'm not going to go to a city, I'm going to be targeted there, I'm going to run and stay in a small village, I'm going to stay out of, off people's radar so that I can keep myself safe. Look at tribal marks. We have tribal marks across a lot of West Africa because people knew that if you were stolen away and taken away from your home and managed to escape, by using those tribal marks, it was almost like a roadmap to get yourself back home, to say, look, you can see this mark, it tells you I'm from this village, how do I get back there? Exactly. So African history is so complex because there's a lot that is part of the natural rise and fall of any civilization, but there's also the fact that there's that outside impact that really sort of set up an atomic bomb in terms of our understanding of ourselves, and the fact that people were trying to recover from that episode, but then they were not allowed to recover from it because straight on the heels of that, as soon as the slave trade sort of ended, we had the scramble for Africa, we had the whole period of colonialization. So people then were still not allowed that chance to recover. And I believe it's only now, in the last few decades, that we're slowly starting to understand that recovery, but only because now people are becoming more aware of that history. Because if you know what happened, if you know where we once were, then you know that we can not only get back there, we can surpass it all.
So there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that have happened in recent times that a lot of people have not really taken a deep look at. So recently, I was hosting a show on cryptocurrency. A lot of people have not really looked at it and realized that what is cryptocurrency? What is the concept of cryptocurrency? They even realize that cryptocurrency is the digital version of what we used to have back in Africa back in the days. Standardization and decentralization by using cowries as against gold.
Yes.
How come people are not immersed in history? How come history is not a very strong part of our culture anymore? What happened?
Because we were specifically not taught our history, because it's a way of maintaining that power over us. So if you look at the average Nigerian, when I went to school in Nigeria, my history started from 1960, independence, and then all the coups and all the things that happened after that. There was that sort of rumbling of, oh yes, we did have some kingdoms beforehand. We had the Oyo Empire, we had the Kanem-Borno Empire, we had King Jaja of Opobo, and so on. But there wasn't much focus on them. It was kind of like, yeah, that doesn't really count very much because they didn't do very much. And it's because the curriculum that we were taught was originally a European curriculum. So why would Europeans want to focus on the greatness of our kings and queens? Because then we would then challenge them. So it's much easier to say, yeah, you guys might have done something, but it doesn't really count. It was only just, a few little kingdoms here and there. Well, actually, no. If you mentioned the Benin Kingdom, the city of Benin had streetlights 200 years before streetlights appeared in London and in New York. They had a form of street lighting. They had the walls of the city were polished so much that the adobe walls almost shone like marble. And you think about it, we use adobe, they go, oh yeah, people build with mud in Africa. Why do we build with mud in Africa? Because it is the perfect material within that environment. Adobe, earth, mud has the most amazing thermoregulatory properties. If you have a mud building, it's able to regulate the temperature within that building to the fact that no matter how hot or cold it is outside, it remains cool inside. In northern Libya, there's a city called Gadames, and that is an ancient Berber city where the buildings there are built out of the same adobe, the same mud buildings. 6,000 years almost. You've got this, not 6,000 years. I think it's about 3,000 years. Yeah. So you've got this city that's been there for so long, whereas the houses in there are still so comfortable to live within because people were in tune with their nature. They had, over time, understood this is what works best in our setting and in our environment. So when you try to bring in a different way, when we now build with concrete across Africa, yes, it's great structurally, but it doesn't do so well for the heat. So then you have to put in air conditioning. And it's about, in the sense of building, going back to those traditional techniques, in the sense of our history, going back to our history, to the fact that we had great people. We have those kings, those queens. We have those empires, that civilization that was there. Greek civilization originated in Africa. The people who went and started the schools in Greece studied in Alexandria at the feet of African scholars. So we sometimes forget that the impact that we have had on sort of the global understanding has always been there. It's just always been overlooked.
So they're taking away most of what we had, and then they start reintroducing it back to us. So like what you just said now they're reintroducing it, and any architect or builder that wants to sound very cerebral, very intelligent, very up-to-date will say sustainable design, using local materials and all of that, and then building houses in a sustainable way to save your power and all of that. They have a lot of our artifacts in museums, and they tell us to pay to pay money to actually view those artifacts. We have to take permission when we want to do exhibitions to borrow those artifacts and then return it back to them. Most of the colonial powers were built on pillage and plundering. Now, when it comes to the history, like you said, they definitely wouldn't have wanted us to be able to challenge them, so they wouldn't have introduced our part of history, into the curriculum that they were teaching us. I mean, even history that's as recent as the 1957 massacre in Enugu at the coal mines is not in any history books that you can find in Nigeria. I always wondered about that. I always used to wonder, how come, nobody said anything about this?
But it's a bit like the Biafran War. That is such a major moment in Nigerian history in particular. And we should all know about it. Yet it's barely mentioned, within sort of the Nigerian historical story. And yet it's one of those pivotal moments where, a group of people said, you know what, we don't want to be part of this union anymore. We want to rule ourselves. And they were made to stay within the union because other powers had other intentions. And that is something that we should be studying from both sides and go, right, these guys had these opinions, these guys had these opinions. When we look back on it from sort of a historical standpoint, what do you think could have happened? What do we think would the outcome have been if it had, if the Biafran movement had been successful? Where do we stand now that it wasn't successful? How do we move forward from it? What are the implications to today? Does it still affect us? This is a conversation that we as Nigerians should be having, but it's never one that it's had because it's convenient to leave it out. Because, again, it's all about controlling the masses. If people don't have these sort of dialogues, these deliberations, then they're not going to understand the depth of what is there, and they can't question the powers. They go, "What? This is what it's supposed to be. This is what we do. Okay, no problem. I'll go along with it." Nigeria, in its sense, is as much as I love my country, it's almost a mistake in the sense that you had three, and I'm talking to three main tribes because I know there, 100, over 250, 300 different tribes, languages within our country. But you have the fact that these three main sort of ethnic groups, the northern, the eastern, the southwest, would, if they had divided themselves, would have probably formed into three countries or communities. And yet, because of British colonial decision, they ended up merged into one. And yet, even within the colonial system, the way the North was governed and ruled was very different from how the South was governed and ruled, and was still bearing the sort of political scars of that difference in rule, even till today. You look at the fact that in the North, it was a lot easier for the British to rule by a system of indirect rule, because you had the Sokoto Caliphate. Now, the Sokoto Caliphate spread across the whole of northern Nigeria. It actually went from northern Cameroon all the way across to Burkina Faso. And this was a system where everybody within that caliphate was subservient to the Sultan, the Sultan of Sokoto. And so the Sultan just had to give one instruction and everybody did it. All the emirs were, subservient to him. So it was very easy for the British to come in and take over the top. And then that way they had control of the masses. Whereas when you look at the Igbos don't have that system of a sultan and oba. They have a more sort of egalitarian democratic setup, where every man in the village is able to come within the circle of elders, speak his mind, say his point, and then they decide all together what the decision is going to be moving forward. Now that group of people are a lot more difficult to rule, because how do you then convince everybody? You can't only convince one person, you have to convince everybody in order to get your way. And then you look at the Yorubas, who had almost a mix between the two. You have within the Oyo Empire, the Alaafin. Now the Alaafin was the king, he was the supreme ruler, but he was held in check by the Oyomesi, right? The Oyomesi was the Yoruba's parliament. So the king, the same like we have in the UK, you've got the queen, but she still, takes on board the decisions of parliament. It was the same within the Oyo Empire. You have the fact that if the Alaafin didn't do what they wanted, he was deposed by the Oyomesi. And so again, when the British tried to rule the Yorubas, they couldn't easily control the Alaafin, because if they told him what to do and the Oyomesi or the people didn't like it, he got kicked out and someone else got put in. So again, that sort of system of rule had to be different to tackle the different people. But those nuances were not taken on board when we became independent. And we sort of said, oh, yes, we're all going to work together and do this. And because we didn't understand the fact that culturally we have very different ways of governing ourselves, and perhaps we should look at a way that this can be done that can suit all people, is, I think, personally, why we have a lot of our issues in Nigeria today.
So, Aya, we could go on and on and on. And for those few who are privileged to actually be watching this right now, because we realize that we have a technical problem, so we're not on live on YouTube and Facebook. I'm sure quite a few of them are mesmerized by all that you're saying. Trust me, I am. So, first things first, I'm going to say this is not over yet. This is part one, okay? We have very limited time left. So, I'm just going to say this is part one of this conversation with you. We're going to have tons of it, I'm sure. But there are two things. Earlier on, you mentioned the issue of institutionalized racism and how people deny, that it exists. We've talked right now about system or forms of government and how colonialism has affected Nigeria as a nation. So two things. First, do you think that Nigeria should split? Historically, that is, not necessarily in today's context.
That's a very difficult one. Historically, I think Nigeria should never have been put together. But seeing that we are together, I think we should make it work. I don't think we would necessarily benefit from a split at this point in our history, because I don't think we are stable enough to survive as three thriving nations if we were to split. Because I think if there was a split, it would be a three-way split.
I think it's going to be much more. What I would have asked anybody honorably would have been, do you think that as Africans, we should develop our own systems of government? Because it seems that democracy doesn't seem to be working for Africans.
Democracy doesn't work for Africans because democracy is not an African thing, for one. But also, where we have managed to work democratically and been successful, those lovely powers that be have come back in and undermined it. You look at Burkina Faso, right? When we have Thomas Sankara. Now, this was a man who came in and said, look at my nation, we're getting rid of the French, we're going to govern ourselves. They became independent. And within 4 years, the amount of change and innovation that this man brought to his country, he brought female rights forward, he brought education for all, he set up infrastructure, he created a government that was actually on the way to being incredibly successful within the African setting, because he took the best of both worlds. He took African traditions and the ways we do things and merged it with what he'd learned from European government. So, but then they didn't want him to succeed. So he was assassinated. Now, some would say he was assassinated by his friend, but then who paid his friend off to do it? And there's a theory that it was actually the French who got his best friend. They had grown up as brothers and had gotten him, of all people, to, create that Julius Caesar movement, where he was the one who instigated the assassination of Sankara, which then plunged Burkina Faso back into where they are today. And this we see across the African continent. You can look at Gaddafi, very much a Marmite character. Many people think he's the devil incarnate. Some people think he was the best thing. Gaddafi was a great ruler for the Libyan people, but he was not great for the Western world. So he was this sort of demon figure was created for him as a way to undermine the good that he was doing within his country. So sometimes we have to look at our African story and just go, you know what? There's more to it. You have to peel back the layers to understand what it is and to appreciate the fact that even something that seems very simple, it never is. So, yeah, I don't think Nigeria splitting would be a great option because there's so much more that we can do together. if we look at the fact that it's Nigeria as a country doesn't actually matter. We are African. So whether you're Nigerian or Ghanaian or Sierra Leonean or Botswana, whatever you are, we are all African. And when we focus on that, when we can unify in that way, that is when our true strength will become apparent.
So in all of this, it seems that Africans are victims. So we've been victims of mass abduction, mass slavery, genocide. The Jews, quote unquote, because they are Israelis and they are Jews. But the Jews, keep going on and on and on about genocide, how they were treated the world, prior to World War II, and then the consequences of World War II and all of that. And everybody is very sensitive about anti-Semitism. But nobody seems to talk about all these different forms of abuse that Africa has gone through. Now, one of the things, or one of the results of that is hypodescent. It is something I'm not going to let go. I was going to make sure I brought it back on because you are also a victim of hypodescent, as I understand.
Indeed.
Now, for those who don't know what hypodescent is, I'm going to quickly share what hypodescent is on the screen for you to have a quick look so that you can have an understanding of what hypodescent actually is. So, in societies that regard some races, ethnic groups of people as dominant or superior and others as subordinate or inferior, hypodescent refers to the automatic assignment by the dominant culture of children of a mixed union or sexual relations between members of different socio-economic groups or ethnic groups to the subordinate group. The opposite practice is hyperdescent, in which children are assigned to the race that is considered dominant or superior. So, now, they look at it and they say there's no institutionalized racism. But a race has been declared to be the superior race. And if you have a drop of blood that, quote unquote, contaminates that superior bloodline, so to speak, you are not one of them anymore. You fall into the race that's determined to be the lesser race. And in a lot of cases, it's actually the black race that this happens to. How have you been able to relate with being half British, living in England, seeing the level of racism going on, and knowing that you are a victim of hypodescent?
Right, so hypodescent is sometimes also called the one-drop rule, okay? And in itself, it's actually more, I think, linked with the American story. So that is where you had the fact that, again, looking back to the history of slavery, the chattel slavery that was most prevalent within the Americas, you had that system that in order to maintain your power, you had to say that I'm different from you. And in order to maintain that difference, you didn't want the races to mix. So in that sense, hypodescent or the one-drop rule meant that even if you had the appearance of being completely Caucasian, if you had a great-great-grandparent who was African, in a sense, as you said, you were then tainted, so to speak, and classified as black. And that was a way for the white owners to maintain their sense of superiority and to maintain their control of power, because people were then, at that time, were not allowed to vote if they were black, they were not allowed to attend schools if they were black, and so on. So by having this one-drop rule, they were able to keep the best of the pie, so to speak, for themselves, because they were not competing with many people. Now, when you look at hypodescent within other communities, within, say, for example, the Nigerian setting, growing up in Nigeria, I was always called Oyinbo, and I hated it. Absolutely hated it. So a lot of people look at Oyinbo, which is the term that's used to refer to somebody who is mixed race, sometimes called half caste, biracial, and you have these different terms that are used. But for me as a child, particularly that word was a taunt. You're walking down the street and it's Oyinbo, Pepe, and I used to go home and cry
So, Oyibo Pepe. Oyibo Pepe, that catchphrase Oyibo Pepe, I think it's going to be a topic for another episode of Just Banter on its own. We'll get to that. Go. Sorry.
But yes, in that sense, for myself, I am very, very light skinned. Okay. As somebody who's half white, half black, I am very, very pale. And if I wanted to, as the word goes, pass, I could. If I was to have my perfect English accent on, and if I was to call myself by my English name and have my hair all straightened, very few people would know that I'm half Nigerian. And if I did not have that sense of pride, that sense of assurance in who I was, I know who I am, then perhaps that's something I might have done. But from a very young age, my parents never talked about white or black. Like, I was never told you're half white, half black. I was always told you're half English, half Nigerian. Because the focus was on my cultural duality. Okay? The color of the skin was not an issue. And although in growing up, the rest of the world then tells you, oh, why are you so light-skinned? Are you sure you're half Nigerian? Why do you speak so well? Are you sure you're half Nigerian? And it's like, how dare you? You know, Nigerians are some of the most eloquent people on the planet. So to be honest, that is my pride. And I've always been proud to be both. I would never say I'm one or the other because both sides of my story have formed who I am. And growing up in Nigeria, especially in a city like Kaduna, so I grew up in Kaduna, which especially in the 80s and the 90s was a very cosmopolitan, very mixed society. You had people from, to be honest, all corners of the world, cultures from all over the world, who all mixed and interacted on very equal footings. And that in its sense was a very wonderful way for a child to be introduced to humanity, with the fact that it didn't matter who you were, where you came from, what your parents were. We were all one in that sense. And I was always interested in people from where they came from. So I would always ask, oh, you're Polish. That's interesting. What kind of food do you eat in Poland? And, you know, what are your stories that you tell at bedtime? And that was my sort of interest in people, as opposed to, okay, you're white, you're black, and so on. But yes, there are probably advantages in the sense of how people perceive me to be. There are sometimes conversations people will have when they don't realize who I am and where I'm from, and you have to pull them up on it and go, hang on a minute, that's out of order, and that doesn't make sense. But you have to do it from a way where you leave that person with more knowledge than anger. Because if I was to come to people with that kind of conversation and say, how dare you say this, blah, 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 they will get defensive and they will lock off they won't listen anymore. And my message won't get through to them. But if you come at it from a way that you almost meet them at where they think they are and tell them, actually, you need to take a step up in your understanding, then you leave them at that from going, hang on, that comment I made is completely, does not have any strength to it, or my understanding of that person as being a certain way because of who I think they are actually doesn't make any sense. So many times when we talk about race within the work setting, within our families, within the, you know, all these issues, you know, the issue of colorism is huge across, you know, the Black community, in the fact that there's a lot of people who think, oh, because I'm so light, I cannot be African, or I cannot understand the African experience. And sometimes this comes from people who have never stepped foot in Africa. You know, you have a lot of people who have that sort of sense that this is my thing and it's only mine. But actually, my heart is in Africa. I grew up there. It has shaped me, and you cannot take that away from me.
Well, we run out of time. But one quick question and just a quick answer. Don't need to. So, how do you feel about Oyibo Pepe now? Just say something quick. 10 seconds.
So when I was young, my mom used to tell me that I should answer them back and say Blackie Jongu, you go Blackie Momo. But now,
All right, Ayo.
response now would be, it's about that understanding with the fact that actually they weren't saying that to me to tease me. It was actually, in a sense, almost a compliment. So at that time, I thought I was being teased, but now I understand that it was actually a compliment. So sometimes you have to take a step back from your personal feeling about a situation, look at the wider picture, and then you understand it better.
It's been great having you on tonight. Like I said, this is part 1. So we are definitely going to go on to part 2. Unfortunately, we had technical issues, so we're not live on Facebook and YouTube, but we're going to be posting this podcast episode onto those channels. So watch out for it. And thank you so much for taking out the time to join us. Yeah, have a great night. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much.